Hello and welcome to Illinois Extension's Commercial Ag Webinar Series. I'm Chelsea Harbach, your host for this webinar series. I'm a commercial ag extension educator with the University of Illinois, stationed at the Research Center outside of Monmouth, Illinois in the western part of the state. This series is held every second and fourth Wednesday of the month at 3 p.m. Be sure to follow our webpage for updates and details/registration for future webinars. We ask that you save your questions for the end of the webinar or submit questions via the chat box throughout the webinar. Also, please be sure that your mics are muted and your video is off to assist with bandwidth during the webinar. You may use your mic to ask questions at the end if that is your preference. Today we welcome Dr. Nathan Kleczewski, Assistant Professor and Extension Specialist with the University of Illinois Department of Crop Sciences, as he discusses stalk rot diseases in corn.
I am excited to talk to you a little bit about stalk rots in corn. These are diseases that are very difficult to manage, but they're probably our most frequently occurred issue that we have in corn production. And as we move forward with the season here, many of us in central and northern Illinois in particular, we're hitting tasseling here in the next few days. That just happens to be a point in time when dry, hot conditions like this can really promote some of these stalk rot issues later in the season. And so what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk a little bit more about the basics of the processes of stalk rots and how they occur. And we're also going to talk about specific stalk rots, how to identify them, and their potential management. So in terms of just some basic information for you, stalk rots oftentimes are going to be occurring later in the season. The plants tend to senesce or die, oftentimes very rapidly, but they will die or senesce much earlier than a typical, and oftentimes their distribution in the field can be very scattered. So this isn't something that's going to affect an entire field, but you might see patches of corn with issues or individual corn plants that have issues with lodging. Obviously, the more plants in a field that have stalk rots and lodging issues, the more of a problem it's going to be. So that's why when we talk about scouting in future slides here, that's going to be very important. Okay, basically what's happening, you think of your stalks as being a nice supportive stalk like a tree trunk, right? The internal tissues rot out of that, and so you really don't have a lot of integrity to those stalks. And when you have maybe a wind or some sort of storm event, your plants lodge and fall over, and then that's going to impact your yields, your quality, all those things. So if we look in Illinois from just 2008 and 2018, 2019, you're looking at roughly about 1% to 2% of the overall yield losses in the state due to stalk rots. That doesn't seem like a lot until you start extrapolating that across all the acres that we have. Also, you need to keep in mind that this is generalized across the state. Specific fields can have issues that are much greater than this, okay? For example, you could easily have a 25, 50 bushel yield loss or more in a field where you have lodging issues like this, and you just can't get that corn up off the ground, or the corn has started to rot and you start losing grain quality and you have issues there, okay? So keep in mind, although the overall statewide average may be low, individually and in portions of the state, you might have elevated levels. And that's why we need to be out there scouting to see what kind of problems we have. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is that many of our stalk rotting pathogens are actually what we would call weak pathogens, right? They tend to come in when the plants are stressed and cause disease. And oftentimes we get many of these pathogens or several pathogens that can be affecting a field or even a plant at the same time, okay? So keep this in mind. It's not going to be straightforward when you're trying to figure out what's going on, but there are some underlying processes that can help explain why you might have stalk rot in some years or under some conditions versus others. So first thing, let's go back to our old biology, plant physiology classes here, right? So photosynthesis, right? We're taking light, we're taking some carbon dioxide and water, those are getting taken up by our plants, okay, by the green tissues in the corn, being turned into carbohydrates, and there's some oxygen there. And obviously, so that carbohydrate budget, that's the fuel that keeps that plant going, right? Keeps it growing, keeps it filling grain, keeps the cells happy, meets all the energy needs of the cells as well. So those carbohydrates in plants are diverted between growth, maintenance, this is just maintaining the cells that are there, and also defense. So it's producing chemicals or compounds that can be utilized to protect the plant. Also, we can consider this as being maybe utilizing those carbohydrates to increase the supportive tissues or the lignin levels, for example, in some of the tissues that can help make it tougher or stronger. But as with anything in the plant, there's a limited carbohydrate budget, right? So the plant only has a certain amount of carbohydrates, and it needs to make decisions with where those carbohydrates go. Now, typically, what we have is a situation where those carbohydrates are being made in those green tissues, and that is considered a source, right? They're being produced there. They get moved to sinks. Those are areas that are in need of carbohydrates. This is a very active process. It's very much like in this animation here, toothpaste being squeezed. Imagine that the toothpaste tube is the leaf, the paste is the carbohydrates. That's your source. They get squeezed out and moved throughout the plants up and down to where it's needed most, whatever tissue is rapidly growing. So early on in the season, the carbohydrate reserves are there to support the growth and maintenance of production of leaves, production of roots. However, once we start moving or shifting our reproduction from vegetative into reproductive growth, then those carbohydrate demands of the plant tissues shift or change. And now it's that ear that is going to be the largest sink. And therefore, that's going to be where the majority of these carbohydrates go. And this is important because this is going to impact stalk rots. So I'll just walk you through this, the carbon stress balance model. And this is something that's been out there for quite some time. Okay, so the idea here is that in general, our stalk rots are going to be occurring due to all that carbohydrate, or the majority of those carbohydrates, being committed towards grain fill. And when you have situations that are going to reduce the carbon budget or are going to increase that sink strength, for example, hybrids that have really big ears, that's going to minimize the amount of carbohydrates available in the rest of the plant. Okay, so during grain fill, once we start to tassel, once those ears come out, the corn is going to be moving carbohydrates that are produced via photosynthesis to that ear. And if we have a situation where we have a limiting carbohydrate budget, like I said before, carbohydrates have to come from somewhere, right? And our corn is going to be storing carbohydrates as starches and also soluble sugars in the roots and in the stalks. So if you have a situation where your carbohydrate budget isn't met, that carbohydrate has to come from somewhere. It tends to come from the roots and the stalks because those are the lowest priority tissues in the plant at that point in time. If you remove those carbohydrates from those areas, those reserves, and you already have a limiting carbohydrate budget, that's obviously going to minimize the amount of availability of resources to maintain those cells and protect those cells. And as a result, we start seeing those tissues sacrificed, okay? So you start to see that can't maintain the cells, the roots will start to senesce and decay. And anytime we have senescing, decaying tissue, that will promote infection by different microbes. And those microbes are fungi, and many of them are going to be involved in our stalk rots. And when those pathogens or fungi infect the roots and start to colonize the stalk, that's going to inhibit water uptake. That's going to further reduce the  budget. And eventually, that's going to result in or promote stalk rot issues, and that's going to be evidenced in earlier senescence and lodging. So, for example, if we want to look at some of these indications or some of the research that's been done on stalk rot in the past, this one study here is pretty old, but still a good one. You have plants that were exposed to just mild water stress at different points in time, before tassel, after tassel, and during grain fill. And they're actually inoculating the soils with Fusarium melaniforme, which is involved in Fusarium stalk rot. And what they're finding is that, or what they found in this particular study, is that the infection or the amount of colonization and stalk rot issues are greater when the drought stress precedes the inoculation, meaning that those plants are under stress and the carbohydrate budgets are already being limited. So that is promoting the inoculation or the colonization of the tissues by this particular fungi. When those drought stress, even in the case where you have rain or irrigation after inoculation, those plants still cannot take up water as fast as those that were not inoculated or not infected by this pathogen. And that resulted in these plants behaving like they're drought stressed, even though they're not. Okay, so once we have a situation where we have an impact colonization of the roots by these microbes, our plants are going to start to underperform and not take up water as well, not take up nutrients as well. Okay, so even mild stress is going to be sufficient to spur stalk rots, hot and dry. That's what we're looking at this year, okay? So think about it here. What are going to be things that are going to increase our risk of stalk rots? They're going to be factors or practices that are going to limit resource uptake and increase the potential for stress in our fields. That means high planting density, especially in non-irrigated fields, okay? Shading limits the amount of light to produce photosynthesis. Water, obviously, we talked about this, nutrients, those plants are all competing with one another. Limiting access means limiting carbohydrate budgets, increased likelihood of stalk rots. Hybrids also vary significantly to their response to stalk rots. Typically, ones that are going to be most affected are ones that have poor stay green scores or extremely large ear sizes, as I mentioned before. Also, pest and pathogen damage. We'll talk about this, but not just the roots and stalks, but also to the foliage, because the foliage is going to be producing the carbohydrates. And if we have factors that are reducing the photosynthetic area, at some point, we're going to reduce it extensively, and we're not going to be able to meet our carbohydrate demands. And so this is why we want to be able to keep our foliage healthy, keep it free of diseases and pests and other problems. Other things that tend to promote stalk rots, cloudy weather after pollination, that's going to limit the amount of light that you're receiving, the quantity of light, and also some other nutrient issues like low potassium with excess nitrogen. That's been implicated as impacting the ability of some of these pathogens to colonize plant tissues, impact the integrity of cell walls and photosynthetic rates, and as we would expect, deficient nitrogen. Okay, so general symptom progression in stalk rots. The first phase is going to be just a rotting and wilting of the plant. This is what you're going to see first in your fields. Okay, the root rot can occur early in the season or it can occur late in the season. These diseases occur throughout the year. Okay, so this is why when we're talking about management, it's very challenging to manage these because infection can occur at any time during the season. You'll see wilt, so your plants will start to get droopy, they'll start to curl. If you're past tasseling and you have ears, oftentimes you'll see those ears will turn gray and droop before the rest of the plants do. That's one potential indication that you might be dealing with stalk rot issues in the future. Leaves will, in general, blight very rapidly. They kind of have a gray or green appearance to them and kind of resemble frost damage if you've ever seen frost damage before. Okay, so there's an animation. I'm not sure what I was trying to show. Oh, okay, so that's what I was showing there. So those are the microbes in the soil. You can see there are different microbes. All right, they're going to be infecting your root this is supposed to be an ear of corn up there, and your ear will start to droop because of the activity of those microbes. That was that high-end animation that I had put in there. So this is an example of rapid blight. This is an image coming from a colleague in Texas recently, actually. And in this case, this rapid blight was actually caused by, or likely caused by, charcoal rot. So when you have significant infection, you can see these plants drop very fast, okay? The second phase in stalk rot progression is decay and lodging. So as those fungi and bacteria continue to move and digest the inner pith of that stalk, that's when you're going to start to really see these issues pop out. Okay, this is when you're going to start to see plants falling over, entire plants dying. And really what we're doing here is we're turning that stalk, right, that tree trunk, from being a solid rod into basically a hollow tube, like a straw. So if this is the typical on the left here, if this is a typical stalk, nice and healthy and white, good support, okay, we can bend those stalks, we can survive heavy winds. But on the right, that's what a stalk rot infected stalk might look like. Again, my excellent animation skills showing that inner pith will pull away from that rind, and so it becomes more of a straw. And as you know, in drinking from cans and bottles with straws, they're pretty easy to bend, as opposed to a pencil, right? So because of that, our plants start to fall over. And scouting for stalk rots becomes very important, especially after grain fill. That's when we really want to be getting out there and looking at our fields. These definitely are not something that you can do driving by a field. You are not going to have a good idea of what you're dealing with across a field because, as I mentioned, it can be scattered or isolated in a field, and you can miss that as you drive by. So you need to get out of your field. You want to scout at least one site for every 10 to 20 acres. That's my general recommendation. You can do more, but I would say that that's probably your minimum amount. Some people say do at least 5 sites per field. I guess you could do that as well, but you just want to have multiple sites across the field. Do not focus on the field edges. Make sure that you're getting a representative sample of that field, and you want to be running transcript sets that cover at least 100 plants. And what you can do there, you can do 3 different things. Okay, you can split the stalks with a knife, and then basically look at the stalks from the base of the soil up through the first 3-4 nodes there that are above the ground, and look for quality of the tissue. It can be healthy. If it's brown, maybe you got a stalk rot issue. That one's a little more involved. Most people do the push test. They're just going to walk. What I do is I'll walk next to corn. I'll push it out at chest level till my arm is straight. It's usually about a 30, 45 degree angle from vertical. If it snaps, you've got a lodging issue. If it doesn't, it comes back, you're fine. And you want to do that for about 100 plants total, at least in your field. So typically when I'm running a transect, I'll do 20, 25 plants in a transect. Just keep track of how many fall over. And then at the end, what you're going to do is add up all of the plants you pushed versus all the ones that lodged. And if you've got a field that has more than 10 to 15% lodging occurring, then what you're going to want to do there is make sure you are scheduling that field as a priority harvest. The longer you let that sit out there, the more likely those issues will continue to progress. Remember, once you get infection, those plants will act drought stressed, and the infection or the stalk rot issues can become more pronounced. But also, the longer they're laying out there, the more likely they are to encounter environmental issues such as winds and storms that can cause those plants to fall down, and you're going to be losing yield and quality. So that's what you want to do during your scouting. You want to figure out what percentage of stalk rot you have so that you can get that corn out of there as soon as possible. Now, there are usual suspects that we have involved with stalk rots. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you can have multiple stalk rots in the same field. You can have multiple stalk rot pathogens in the same plant. So managing these often is going to involve a combination of practices to kind of hedge your bets and reduce the chance that you're going to deal with stalk rot issues. Most of the things that we're going to do for managing stalk rots is practices that alleviate stress on our plants are going to be very important. Now, keep in mind, most of our stalk rotting pathogens are going to be soil-borne. These aren't going to be things that are going to be blowing over from other regions. So if you have a history of stalk rot in a field, that's something you want to keep in mind. And as you are scouting, realize that the answer might not be very straightforward. Okay, so basically that's what I'm just pointing out in these slides here, is that you have a lot of organisms can be pathogenic. And the other thing is, you get out in the field a lot of times when people are looking at stalk rots, it's right before harvest, right? And they're going, what the heck, my corn's lodged, or why did my corn senesce so rapidly? Well, when you have plants that die and senesce, what that tissue is, basically it's a golden corral for a lot of these opportunistic secondary fungi. And so if you take that sample at that point in time when the plants are totally dead and say send it to a clinic or look at it and try to identify what the problem is, you might find a lot of different things in there. Some of those can be pathogens, and some of those could be, for example, alternaria or some other sugar fungi that are just growing on dead, decaying tissues, and they're not actually the cause of the issue. So that's one of the things to keep in mind here too, is that sometimes we have all these other things that can actually make it difficult for us to diagnose the problem. So the first one I want to talk about here in terms of our stalk rots is gibberella. And gibberella is our most common stalk rot that we see in the United States. It's actually gibberella and fusarium. We talk about fungi, there's sexual and asexual states. So gibberella is actually a sexual state of some fusarium species. So if we split stalks and they're infected with gibberella, typically at those nodes or near those nodes, you're going to see a bright pink to almost red discoloration of that stalk tissue. And that's what you see in this image here. In general, those lower internodes, if you split that stem, they're going to be kind of brownish and have that discoloration. And if you look on the outside of the stem, what you'll see with the aid of a hand lens is these blue to black balls. Okay, so these are pinhead size, very, very small. They tend to be clustered at the nodes as well. And if you have a fingernail, I chew my fingernails off, but for those of you who have fingernails, you could just take your fingernail and those will pop right off of the stalk very easily. And that's going to be one characteristic of this particular pathogen. The life cycle of gibberella, very similar to the other pathogens that we're going to be dealing with in our fields. It overwinters in your corn residue, basically. And when conditions are conducive, wet, warm, you're going to have the majority of the infections coming in through the roots, but they also, it can move up into the stalk, so it can be rain splashed onto the lower stalks. If you've got wounds there, if you've got shredding, anything like that, those spores can infect a little higher up in the plant and cause some deterioration that way. Then if the plant is stressed, that's when you get infection, you get the shredding of the pith, and then you have those issues that we talked about. It's a very general life cycle for a lot of these organisms. Now, when it comes to management of gibberella and a lot of these other stalk rots I'm talking about, one of the things that's important is residue management. A lot of us are practicing no-till agriculture, conservation-till agriculture. So the more residue that you have on the surface, the more potential inoculum you're going to have there. And so one of the recommendations you might have if you're not in a no-till or conservation-till situation is some form of tillage. And just keep in mind that tillage is a pretty general term. Some people can consider a turbo tilling, which is just basically raking the surface of your field as tillage. Is that what I consider tillage? No. But the different implements that we have leave different amounts of residue on the surface, as is evidenced here by this table that I have from the University of Nebraska. You can see there's a huge difference between if you're moldboard plowing or disc plowing to doing some of these other types of practices. Okay, so keep in mind that the implement you're using is going to affect the amount of residue on the surface as well. Fusarium stalk rot is the second stalk rot that I'd like to talk about. Very common in Illinois as well. There are many different species, or several different species of Fusarium that can be involved, but typically Fusarium versilioides is our culprit. When you look at fields that have stalk rot issues caused by Fusarium, typically, again, at the nodes, you'll see kind of a light pink to orangish growth. That inner pith will be white and shredded and kind of spongy. Roots will oftentimes be rotted as well. And one of the other things I tend to look for is I'll look at the cobs, and oftentimes if we have stalk rots in our plants, we might also have infection of the ear. A lot of time you might see that starburst infection of individual kernels on corn ears. COLLETOTRICHUM, okay, that's the organism, the fungus that causes anthracnose of corn. And this is actually one that I find pretty interesting because it actually has 3 different phases to it. You have your foliar blight, which occurs early in the season, causes those symptoms, as you can see from that photo from Pat Lips. Oftentimes you're going to have small little, what I call candle or flame-shaped irregular lesions that'll pop up on those young plants early in the season because rains and kind of that nice humid conditions cause those spores to splash up from the residue onto those leaves, and you get that light infection. Then as that plant ages, as it gets past that, again, I don't know the specific leaf stage, I could vary by hybrid, but usually once it gets past that V8 stage, they become resistant to the foliar stage of this disease. So there's changes in the chemistry of the foliage that prevents or inhibits infection by this pathogen. And so you just see this infection early in the season, not later in the season. We tend to say that it does not indicate that you're going to have stalk rot or top dieback issues, but what it does tell you is you have COLLETOTRICHUM in your field, and you should be paying attention to your field later in the season. Top dieback is when this disease comes in from infects at the top, and then you're going to start seeing basically a reverse stalk rot, where the top of the plants will develop the rot and lodge, not the bottoms. And then we also have our typical stalk rots, which occur just like I described previously. Now, just like Gibberella, this one's going to be infecting via roots, spores, and wounds. Very similar life cycle. We get to R1 and you get cloudy, warm, humid weather. That's when we're going to start seeing more issues with COLLETOTRICHUM or anthracnose. Now, this is kind of what you might see in some of your plants. An image on the left there from Dr. Robertson at Iowa State. She's been working on this disease for quite some time. And right there, what you're seeing is some top dieback. So you've got spores that have infected at the top. Conditions were conducive. That was a hybrid that was very susceptible. And it's actually causing that plant to senesce and wilt. And eventually that plant probably will lodge. That upper half of the plant will kind of fall over and bend over. Okay, when you look at the upper portions of those tissues, a lot of times you'll see kind of this gelatinous, goopy, orangish, salmon-colored growth on those tissues. If you look really closely, oftentimes at those tissues, you're also going to see little whiskers. Those whiskers, you need a hand lens to see those, but those whiskers are called seta. Or CT, and they're fungal structures that are associated with this particular genus of fungus. On the rinds themselves, as the infection progresses, you'll actually see this very distinguishing symptom, which is a black, shiny discoloration of the rind. It can't be scraped off. You can often see it in large sections of the stalk, and that's going to be, between the whiskers and the fact that you're seeing this black, shiny decomposition on the outside, those are going to be fairly indicative of COLLETOTRICHUM issues. If you split those stalks, you can see right here the discoloration of the pith, especially at the nodes where you get that rotting. That's what it's going to look like. You're not going to see the red or pink or anything like that. Now, anthracnose is different from gibberella and fusarium, where typically gibberella and fusarium we're going to be talking about rotation and tillage being important for management. With anthracnose, we also have hybrids that have some actual resistance to COLLETOTRICHUM or anthracnose stalk rot. So if you do have a history of anthracnose, you can go in and select hybrids that have better resistance scores for that disease, and that can really help manage this particular disease. So again, if you have top dieback, if you see those shiny, the shininess on those stalks and lodging issues, probably dealing with anthracnose. Next time you go in there with corn, we want to be making sure we select a hybrid with more resistance. Again, tillage going to be important to reduce residue if that's possible, but crop rotation can help too. So if we go a year out of corn and aren't doing corn after corn production, we're going to have less corn residue, and that should be less inoculum as well. One of the things to keep in mind, and I mentioned this earlier, managing that early season leaf blight doesn't have any impact on stalk rot. And just to show or to illustrate this point here, this is a study coming from Dr. Esker. He's at Penn State now, but at this time he was, Wisconsin was really lucky to have him over there. He was doing some work on anthracnose, and they have all these different sites in 2 years, and they were looking at different practices on the amount of leaf blight severity, anthracnose leaf blight severity, and then the amount of stalk rot. And pretty much what you're showing here, what we're seeing here, is that there's no clear association between the AUDPC or the actual leaf blight severity that we see and the amount of stalk rot. So in this case, and remember these are right here, if we look at our stalk rot, these numbers are indicating the closer to 1 we get, the more the better the association. So the more perfect that association. In this case, only 5 out of 18 areas had some association, but these are very, very weak correlations right here, 0.2, 0.3. That's not a very strong correlation. So this pathogen is much more likely to enter through the roots and be favored that way. And for that reason, spraying fungicides on the top isn't likely to impact the amount of stalk rot later in the season. And that goes with all of our other ones that we're talking about as well. Okay, the fungicide sprays can have other effects, which we'll talk about, but as far as directly impacting the disease or the stalk rot, there's not really good evidence indicating that. Here's another great disease. I like this disease a lot because I think it's really pretty. Of course, coming from an ugly fat guy like me, that doesn't mean much, but PHYSODERMA stalk rot is a disease that's really been on the uptick in the last 5-10 years. And it's kind of surprising that it hasn't received very much attention, although, you work on what you can and what, people are interested in. I'd say in the last 2-3 years, there's been a lot of an increase in interest in this disease. Historically, this has not been something that has caused many issues in corn production throughout the United States, except recently we're starting to see a lot more of it out there. Some hybrids are extraordinarily susceptible, and it's become one of those issues that is kind of built up. And it's probably because it hasn't been an issue in the past, and we just haven't been selecting for good materials for it. We haven't been able to screen for it because there's not much of it out there, and it's not a priority. And it's been able to build up, and now it's at a point where we have it out there, and now we're starting to screen for it. So I do know industry has been very active with screening this, and there's been some other research out there. We're doing some research on this. Dr. Robertson at Iowa State is doing work on this as well. This is a disease, again, soil-borne. It needs really hot weather, or that really warm, weather that's in the 70s to 80s is going to really promote this disease. Hard driving rains early in the season also are going to promote this disease. So as basically how this infection occurs is you have those raindrops hitting the soil, hitting the residue. Inside those tissues and on the soil are going to be structures of this fungal-like organism. that will be rain splashed into the whorl. So this infection is going to be occurring V5 through, V10, V12 even. Those structures or structures will move into the whorl there in between the leaves or leaf sheath and the stalk. You get some rain following that. You get 72 hours of constant moisture. Those sporangia germinate that release these little spores then that infect during the daytime. And that's pretty neat because you're going to see symptoms on the foliage that are very distinctive. And one of the things you can look for, you have infection early in the season, right? V5, V10, V12, somewhere in there. You'll start to see these symptoms developing then on leaves later on in the season. Typically R1, R2 is when you're going to start to see the foliar symptoms. You're going to have these kind of brownish to purplish spots. They're going to be found in bands, and they're found in bands because those bands would be like counting tree rings. The infection only occurs during the day when it's wet. And so oftentimes you look at a leaf and you'll see these ribbons of symptoms. That's kind of like, it's giving you an indication of how many days it was wet and how many infection events you had. Inside those black spots are going to be the structures of the fungus that will overwinter and persist for years in your soil in the absence of corn. Okay. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here, the foliar symptoms are fairly superficial. Now, again, there's hybrid by hybrid differences. I want to be careful with what I'm saying here. But we see from this disease a node rot. So when you get the susceptible hybrid, the sporangia germinate, the spores infect right at those nodes. What happens is you get the outer rind that will rot out there, and the pith will be unaffected. And what you end up with is this node rot on the lower portions of the plants. And as you're walking through the field, you'll hear this. I mean, it can be confused with green snap, but you are going to see the brown, black right there on the outside of those lower 2-3 nodes. And these are going to pop as you're walking through the fields. Going to sound like almost like gunshots in some cases. Things to keep in mind, lower nodes are going to be typically infected the most. As that plant ages, it becomes more resistant. Now, why that is, again, is it similar to COLLETOTRICHUM or something like that? I'm not sure. But we do see that there's not really any correlation between the hybrids that produce strong foliar symptoms or infections and stalk rot. So just because you have a lot of foliar infections, it doesn't mean you're going to have a lot of stalk rot. You can have stalk rot without foliar infections and vice versa. Anecdotally, we've heard reports that hybrids are somewhat specific. Okay, so there has been an indication that there are hybrids that will suffer more from the node rot issues and some that will have more of the foliar issues. Personally, for me, if I have a hybrid that's showing the foliar issues, I wouldn't be concerned. If we've got one that's suffering from a lot of node rot and snapping, you might want to change the source of the material that you're planting in that field. Definitely make sure you're trying another hybrid if you're going back in there for another season. And actually, before I move forward with this, remember, this is a disease that's going to overwinter for many years in the absence of corn. So things like tillage and rotation might not be super effective, but again, it's going to reduce the amount of inoculum that you have in the field. Any kind of foliar applications of fungicides for controlling this disease, if they were to be made, would have to be made early in the season when the plants are more susceptible and those spores or sporangia are moving into the whorls, because that's what's getting infected. You see these symptoms pop up at BTR1. They're going to be scattered in the field, usually only a couple leaves per plant. You might think it's a foliar disease and you might call in a fungicide application. Just be aware that that disease isn't going to progress anymore. It's not going to spread anymore. and that fungicide isn't really going to have any kind of significant impact for reducing your potential node rot issues. Diplodia is another one that we're interested in, and one of the reasons we're really interested in this in the southern part of the state is that there's two types of pathogens, Stenocarpella, that can infect corn, and we typically are concerned about Matus, but there's another one that's out there that we don't screen too much for, that has larger spores, and we're still learning a lot about it. So there's two potential pathogens out there. Diplodia macrospora is the other one. Now this is a disease that, just like a lot of our other stalk rots, hot, dry conditions before R1, then you get the warm, wet weather after R1. That's when you're going to start to see this disease popping up. It's going to be infecting through the roots, but this is very similar to COLLETOTRICHUM or GIBBERELLA, that it can also infect at the nodes. Now, this one can be confused with GIBBERELLA. One thing to keep in mind here is when you look at the nodes, you will see those black pinhead structures, very similar to GIBBERELLA, but if you have nice nails, like Dr. Robinson does in this image, you can run those on the surface and you will not be able to scrape those off. So those structures do not come off very easily. They're embedded in the tissue. You can kind of see that with a hand lens. Okay, they're not going to have those little eyelashes on them like COLLETOTRICHUM. When you split that stalk, in general, it's going to be very brown in color. And one of the things you might even notice if you take a stalk back, if you have a microscope or something fancy, is under high humidities, you'll actually get out of those black spots, you'll get a little exudation of the spores coming from those structures, and kind of looks like this. Kind of reminds me of that Dr. Pimple Popper show when I see those images. Another one here I mentioned earlier, this one, charcoal rot. When we think about charcoal rot, obviously in corn, but this is a pathogen that has a really wide host range. This particular organism likes it really hot and dry, really hot and dry. And I showed you that image earlier from Texas that was caused by charcoal rot. This one, you split those stalks, especially starting at the lower nodes there. Pith will be shredded, but inside that pith or on that pith, you're going to notice black balls or black structures, sclerotia of that fungus. Those are the overwintering structures of the fungus. Pretty easy to identify with the aid of a hand lens. Okay, this disease is really one where it has a super wide host range, right? So rotation, not going to be very effective. The sclerotia overwinter for a long time in the absence of the host, so tillage isn't going to be very effective as well. But really it's about managing plant stress. And a lot of us in Illinois are not irrigating. I mean, we might have half a dozen pivots throughout the state. I might be joking a little bit, but we don't have very much irrigation in the state. Most of us are dry land. So it's not like we can manage this by improving irrigation during hot, dry periods. So really, it's those other practices, the population numbers, making sure you have your spacing right, your population adequate and not over the top, and our balanced nutrition, that'll put you in a better spot to avoid this. But you're not going to have very resistant hybrids available. This is just one of those diseases. When it's hot and dry, you might see this one popping up, and just do what you can to manage it. Here is one that I dealt with a lot on the East Coast. You're going to see this more often in, say, sweet corn production or specialty corn production, bacterial stalk rot. So this is one of the few cases where we don't have a fungus infecting. We actually have a bacterium, and it's a smelly bacterium. It likes it really hot. Okay? The conditions like we've had and very wet, it's going to be moving up from the residue and infecting at the nodes oftentimes, and the bacteria will continue to develop and produce toxins that decay the tissue, and it's kind of going to progress downwards from the point of infections, and then you'll have this kind of twisting and degradation of the stalks. The big thing, the most diagnostic feature of this, besides the fact that it's a bacterium and you don't see any fungal structures, is that it smells. It smells really bad. If you've, well, I don't want to describe it, but it smells like maybe somebody who hasn't showered in a while and maybe been outside for a bit. That's going to be an indicator of stalk rot. How are you managing that? Now, again, rotation and tillage are going to be pretty effective for it. It doesn't overwinter very well in the absence of corn, especially if you get it out of there and for a year or two. If you're irrigating, we want to avoid excessive irrigation, especially if it's hot out. The big thing, typically when we do see bacterial stalk rot issues, it's because people are irrigating from ditches or ponds. Sweet corn, specialty corn like that, this pathogen loves to hang out in ditches and ponds as epiphytes and endophytes on other weeds and grasses. Okay, so you want to avoid that if possible. If you are irrigating from a ditch or a pond, chlorination. So there are some apparatuses that you can purchase to help chlorinate your water. That can help, but not really a huge issue in our field corn. Okay. Now here's your cheat sheet. I guess you can take a picture of this, but this is kind of going over all the diseases I talked about and some of the defining or distinguishing characteristics of those diseases. And you know what to look for and not look for as you're scouting your fields. Now remember, I did mention that foliar diseases can be associated with stalk rots, and same go for insects. Now keep in mind, our corn that we're planting, for the most part, can take a lot of punishment before we start to see a yield reduction. But under the right circumstances, that amount of punishment can be sufficient to cause yield losses and enhance our issues with stalk rots. Now remember, and this is what I want to point out here, if you have a pathogen that comes in and starts affecting your ear leaf and above after tassel to a significant degree, I say 10% severity on that ear leaf, 5% severity or more on that ear leaf, that can be sufficient enough to reduce your carbohydrate budgets, where you start to see those carbohydrates then being limited, and then the issues with starch and carbohydrates being moved from lower tissues occurring. Our most common diseases that we deal with in Illinois are gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight, some of the late season rusts, and in some occasions tar spot also can be an issue as well. So anytime we're reducing that green tissue and we're still filling the grain, that could potentially enhance our issue with stalk rots. So that being said, management of foliar disease is going to be very important as well. Now, if we're managing our foliar diseases, focus on the ones that are the most common and that you can deal with. Select hybrids that have the most resistance to these common foliar diseases, particularly gray leaf spot and northern corn leaf blight in the northern part of the state. If you're in the southern part of the state and you have the ability to choose something with a little southern rust resistance, now that's not going to necessarily prevent southern rust from taking off, but it can reduce the amount of damage by that particular pathogen. Probably want to go for that as well. So speak with your seed dealers, your agronomists, go for something that fits into your rotation, that is going to get you the yield you want. It's going to meet your needs for your farm, but also is going to be going after those foliar diseases that are more common for you. Selection of a good resistant hybrid can reduce or negate the need for a fungicide application. Actually, I wish I would have put a image here from Trey Price at LSU, just sent out on Twitter today or yesterday, an image of northern corn leaf blight resistant versus susceptible. They've had quite a bit of rain going down there, and it's night and day. Clean tissue versus highly blighted tissue that probably needs a fungicide on the susceptible. So it makes a big difference if you've got resistance available to you. Now, here's some examples of what I'm talking about in terms of stalk rots and managing foliar diseases. So in this case, in this trial conducted at Illinois way back in 2003, that's why some of the products here, you still will come across these, but these may not be our quote unquote, our premium products. But in this case, you have a non-treated check, and then you have tilt quadricin headline applied at tassel. And then you're looking at the amount of ear blight versus the amount of stalk rot. And you can see here, this is a significant amount of ear blight. I was talking about 5–10% on the ear leaf. He's got 65% on his ear leaf here. And then the reduction, of course, depending on the product here. And you can see this is actually a really nice indicator. When you have severe disease, foliar disease, the application of fungicides for managing those foliar diseases can reduce your amount of stalk rot as well. So he was utilizing this stalk rot scale here. So he was kind of in this category between the 3 and the 4 in his controls and even with his tilt. But then when we move into quadricin headline, he's down in the 2s and 3s. So a little bit of stalk rot, but not nearly as much as he has in his non-treated checks. Now, you can take that and you can this is another example here that comes from our trials that we conducted this would have been in 2018 up in Monmouth, northwest part of the state. In this case here, we've got about 21% disease in our non-treated checks, 40% disease in our non-treated checks, and our application of fungicides, reducing that at least by half or nearly half or more, depending on our products that we're using. And you can kind of see here, going down from 8% numerically down to 0% of stalk rot in some of these trials. So again, not necessarily a one-to-one correlation, but in general, if we're applying our fungicide, we are seeing a numerical reduction in our stalk rot. I am a little, I'd be a little skeptical of this particular data set simply because we weren't able to get separation here, but it's just one site, 1 year, and these are small plots, and oftentimes that occurs with small plots because only an ear or two difference can make a big difference in yields, and also when we're running these stalk rot trials. Here's one in 2019 where we didn't have a lot of foliar disease, and basically what I'm showing here is when the foliar disease is low, even though we can see separation, it's below the point where it's really going to be impacting our stalk rots, and that's kind of what we're seeing here is there's no kind of pattern or trend or statistical difference between the application of our products at VT and the amount of foliar disease in stalk rot. Okay, so managing those diseases in cases where you potentially could have a lot of disease will be very important in managing your stalk rots. But if you're a low disease year, or if you have a hybrid that just simply is resistant to your common diseases that could be problematic in your area, that is going to kind of limit the utility of fungicides for managing stalk rots. So overall, managing stalk rots requires an integrated approach. And what do I mean by integrated approach? I mean that you're going to be hedging your bets by utilizing multiple practices. Cultural agronomic practices, okay, hybrid selection, pathogen management. We want to be minimizing the stress, especially around that tasseling grain fill period, to minimize our issues with lodging due to the stalk rot syndrome and some of the processes that I described earlier. So we want to avoid excessive plant populations. So whatever your region is, whatever your land can support, whatever your agronomists or CCAs recommend, that's what you want to be going with. Try to avoid overdoing it with our populations. And a lot of people want to push populations, and especially dry land corn, if you're not irrigating, that can be a very difficult task, and it could potentially increase your lodging issues later on in the season. Balanced nutrition. I mentioned that, we want access to nitrogen, but we also want to make sure our potassium levels are where they need to be and everything else. We don't want to be limiting anything in that plant. So we want a really good fertilizer program. Don't push things too far. Rotation can help, especially for those of you who don't have access or don't feel like doing any kind of tillage, like serious tillage, like moldboard plowing or things like that. Rotation can help reduce the amount of corn residue on the surface. That can reduce the amount of disease. That can help with some of these issues, but not others, right? So for things like PHYSODERMA, which has a pretty limited host range, or even DIPLODIA, the less residue on the surface, the less potential that you have there in a season, although they still can overwinter for years as resistant spores. That can minimize your amount of disease in the future. Tillage, obviously, going to be bearing that residue. That's going to be more important if you're doing corn on corn. And your hybrid selection is going to be really important for some diseases. But if you are concerned about stalk rots, one of the things you want to keep in mind is that stay green score. I tend to tell people, hey, you want to be selecting the hybrid that meets your needs, but you want one that has a good stay green score, because there are other physiological and anatomical features of those hybrids that inherently allow them to maintain the integrity of those stalks for a longer period of time. And therefore, they're not going to be as prone to lodging issues. And so going after something that has a higher stay green score can reduce the potential lodging issues you might have later in the season. And then you want to be managing your stress, okay, on those plants that arise from foliar diseases and potentially insects. Biggest foliar diseases for us: gray leaf spot, northern cornleaf blight, southern rust, northern part of the state, maybe tar spot. Those are going to be the ones that can impact our corn, especially if they get there before VT. But we want to be out there scouting our fields for foliar diseases during the season to make sure that we minimize the disease before it becomes problematic. And I mentioned hybrid selection already with the stay green, but again, something that has good resistance to specific stalk rots can be helpful. Also, something that has good resistance to foliar diseases of impact or importance to you in your region, your field, will be helpful for you. It can minimize the need for a fungicide, can give you a little comfort in knowing that you have less risk, okay? But the big thing is you schedule your fields that have 10 to 15% or more stalks lodging at that, R5 stage or so. Schedule those to be harvested first. And if you do harvest early and your grain's a little bit wet, make sure you're drying that down below 18% or so, because you don't want to have any additional issues with ear rots and stuff like that while it's in storage. Here's a little risk sheet that I've made up for stalk rot. Again, this is something we can print off and make available for you. It's just kind of a risk score, right? So you can go through your different fields and you can just kind of give yourself points based on where you fall on this particular scale. If you have 3 to 6 points, you're going to be at low risk. Medium risk will be at 7 to 10. If you're more than 10 points, you're at high risk. This will give you an indication or give you a little more leverage in going out and scouting particular fields. I'm a big proponent of scouting. I think everyone should be out there at least through R3 looking at your fields as often as possible, every week or two. I say every 10 days is a good amount. I know we all can't do that, especially the big guys out there. But this could be a little score sheet that could help you out. So in sum, stalk rots. In general, it's not a particular super aggressive pathogen that causes the issue. Oftentimes it's due to plants being under stress because our corn is using carbohydrates from photosynthesis. to grow, defend, and maintain itself, and it has this limited budget that it has to balance. And when we start to produce our ears, those carbohydrates start to get shunted to the ears, and they have to come from somewhere. If it can't get them from the foliage, it has to get them from the roots and the stalks. That makes things a lot easier for some of these opportunistic rotting fungi to enter and cause problems. Other pathogens are a little more aggressive. You know, you talk about COLLETOTRICHUM and things like that. That can cause stalk rots directly. But by and large, we are going to have more problems with stalk rot when we have plants that are more stressed right around that tasseling time. So you want to be making sure you are integrating your cultural practices, your hybrid selection, and pest management practices, because that is going to give you the best chance or best opportunity to limit your stalk rot issues in the future. And with that, I am going to finish up this talk. Again, thank you very much for attending, and I will take any questions you may have.
All right, before we open the floor for questions, as we have with the past webinars in this series, we're going to take another moment for mental health.
Hi, when was the last time you did some physical activity and you felt really good afterwards? My name is Chelsea Byers, and I'm a family life educator with Champaign, Ford, Iroquois, and Vermilion counties. Today, I'm here for your moment for mental health, and our focus is on the benefits of physical activity when it comes to having feelings of anxiety and depression. Did you know that physical activity can be great for both your physical health and your brain health? When we think about brain health, we also want to talk about mental health. When you exercise, you release the feel-good endorphins. They promote feelings of well-being that exercise can give you. It increases that blood circulation to your brain, and it just makes you feel good. So when you're thinking about physical activity, it's not only about your body health. When you're out exercising, you can take your mind off your worries. Think about focusing on your movement or your breath. Focus on something other than your worries. Think about engaging with your friends and family. Play with your kids. Do something with a friend. You know, I always encourage people to be active health managers. You can be an active health manager or a passive health manager. But being an active health manager means that you're taking care of your health. So engage in some physical activity, relieve some tension, do something in a healthy way, something that's positive for your health. We all know that when we're feeling stressed out, sometimes we choose the not so healthy ways of relieving that tension. When you think about physical activity, the CDC recommends 30 minutes of exercise with moderate intensity, 3 to 5 days a week. What's moderate intensity? Things like brisk walking, something that gets your heart rate up a little. Find activities that you enjoy. Jogging, swimming, cycling, even gardening and dancing count. Start slow though. Increase your stamina over time. Don't do too much too fast. It's a surefire way to get hurt. And always check with your doctor before you change your physical activity regimen. Thank you for joining us today for a moment for mental health. Take care and get out there and be active.
Okay, so Nathan, we have a couple of questions here in the chat. The first one is from Alejandro. What can you tell us about the use of phosphites as biostimulants to enhance plant health?
Thank you for the question, Alejandro. So phosphites in general, my experience with them has been through vegetable production. So they've been used predominantly to manage some of our, what I would call our weaker pathogens in those systems. In particular, things like lima beans and snap beans. We use K-Phyte, Prophyte, things like that quite a bit. I have no experience with these on field corn, and I'm not sure if again, this is related to stalk rots, if they would have any impact on stalk rots or not. Definitely would be interesting to look at, though.
All right. Any follow-ups to that, Alejandro? Okay. The next question in the chat is from Doug. Can that cheat sheet be made available to us? Will you be able to do that, Nathan?
Yeah, oh yeah, that's not a problem. I just got to figure out where we want to put it. So more than likely, it'll be something that I'll put up on my website or my well, I guess the website is where I'll put it. So that is the Illinois Field Crop Disease Hub. If you Google that, that's my website, and you can sign up there for email alerts and that sort of thing. So when it's available, then you'll just be able to look at it whenever.